Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, colleagues, students, friends. My name is Luisa Białasiewicz, and as the academic co-director of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's seminar, which is the fourth of a series of the European Politics in Transition series organized by my colleague, Professor Sarah de Lange. So thank you, Sarah, for putting this series together. And this is a series that we're organizing together with Spouw 25, and we thank them also very much for helping steer tonight's discussion. So today we have a wonderful panel of observers of Dutch politics who will help us assess the upcoming Dutch elections from a broader European perspective. And as ACES, we thought that if we could bring something to the ongoing debates, because certainly there have been countless and there will be countless seminars, webinars on the elections next week. If we could bring a different perspective, it would certainly be that of, bringing European questions and a wider European, as I said, vision into the elections, a vision that has been actually quite absent until quite recently. So much so, and most of you or many of you in the audience will be aware of this, that a hashtag campaign was started on Twitter with the EU elephant or the EU olifant to bring the European elephant back into the room. A very successful campaign, and we'll say something a little bit about that, but we hope that we can also add to it, at least in some small way. So we are bringing to our virtual stage tonight three wonderful commentators. So let me briefly introduce them to you, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how we're going to structure tonight's discussion. Our first speaker will be Caroline Defrauter, and many of you will know Caroline. She's a frequent visitor to ACES events and is in fact part of our International Advisory Board. So Caroline is the Europe correspondent for the NRC Handelsblad, now based in Oslo, previously in Brussels and many other places besides. She also very frequently comments for Carnegie Europe, for foreign policy, and has a new book coming out on the Habsburgs and the Habsburg legacy that should be, I'm assuming, pretty soon in stores, if we are able to access it in a real physical store. So we're very, very happy to have her back with us tonight. Following Caroline, we will have Matt Steinglass, who is the Europe correspondent for The Economist, based in the Netherlands, and previously also the Netherlands correspondent for the Financial Times. So we'll have Matt follow Caroline. And finally, we're very lucky to have with us Pepijn Bergson, who is a research fellow at the Europe program at Chatham House, and previously a policy advisor at the Dutch government, as well actually as for the Economist Intelligence Unit as well. So what we have asked our panelists to do is to open up the discussion with a very brief presentation, taking on one aspect of these upcoming elections, or one perspective. We will then give them a little bit of time to answer any other kind of points that may have arisen. And then we're very keen to open up the discussion to everybody out there. Since we want to make this very much a conversation. You will see, and I'll remind you of this later on as well, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please type your questions there, and we will do our best to take them into the debate. So without further ado, I will turn the virtual floor over to Caroline, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Louisa. I guess I have a few small remarks, and there is one maybe I will flesh out a bit more than the others. I haven't lived in the Netherlands for I think 25 years now. So I'll leave that maybe for somebody else, all the details and the ins and outs. But looking from outside from the outside to the Netherlands, I see a few things. The first one is that this time key issues are being shoved under the carpet. You know, not even migration is much discussed. That's clear. Leaders of the different parties who are holding debates night after night on television, they're very polite as well. It's more polite than before, is my impression. No one is really throwing mud. Of course, coalition parties, they cannot criticize the government too much. And others, or some of them, are also thinking of the next government already, which will probably comprise 4 or 5 parties again. And they don't want to say too many controversial things. So it's a bit of a strange and a sterile, I would say, affair. Second impression is that the international angle isn't there. Huh? Europe is totally absent from those debates. This is not new. It's pretty regular. It's always been the case. It's because I think that it's because of several reasons. The Dutch position in Europe is complicated, or ambivalent rather. We are in the heart of Europe, the Dutch, participating with every program under the sun, everything that was started since 1952. But actually, we often like to behave as outsiders. We're very transatlantic at heart. We love the US, we love the UK, and that's, I think, something cultural. And it's only when we become a bit more rational that we realize, like, oh, we are on the continent, and this is where we are, and this is where we earn a living, and it's a damn good living. Huh? So our role in Europe is a bit difficult to explain. It's gray tones, I would say, and it also takes time. So what do? We just avoid it. There's very little in Dutch school books. We pretend Europe is just, you know, some kind of economic form of cooperation, and that it's good for Philips and other Dutch companies. And when our politicians talk about Europe, if they talk about it at all, they talk about money, and that's about it. Third remark, what I find interesting is that this time, this absence is no longer taken for granted. Usually there are very few people bringing up the fact that no one mentions Europe during the election campaign, and I'm usually one of them, so I should know. And now suddenly, the EU elephant was already mentioned, who got a hashtag and is everywhere suddenly. Now there are many people who are questioning the absence of any debate about Europe. You know, there's something in the air. Many people are saying Europe is important for us. Why don't we discuss it? And what you see now is that politicians who do want to discuss it, they are actually doing rather well in the polls. We shouldn't exaggerate it. Those are not the biggest parties. Look at Volt, for example. It's a small newcomer party, but they're steaming ahead, and they will get 1, 2, maybe 2 or 3 seats. And I think they were eating votes from D66, the centrist liberals. But D66 is not going down. It's slightly going up as well. And this, I think, shows us something. As was just mentioned, I've just written a book on the Habsburg Empire and the European Union, a book about Europe, in other words. And to my big surprise, all the bookshops are closed in the Netherlands. Within 1 week, it was published last week, it saw 3 editions sold out, and now it's landed straight on the bestseller list, which is very strange for a book about Europe in the Netherlands. I mean, I'm happy about it, but I take this as a little sign as well. My fourth point and last is that I think abroad in other EU countries, they're not too concerned. Rutte, Prime Minister Rutte, and they know the guy. Yes, he was nasty to Italy. And yes, he is stingy. But that's just one aspect of the new Dutch positioning, I would say, since Brexit. This is just a financial monetary aspect, which is definitely the loudest. But Rutte is also the man, and this gets much less attention, who is closer to France than before, drafting European proposals together with officials in Paris on investment screening and big tech. And the Dutch are also preparing a paper with Spain on strategic autonomy. Rutte has just called for vaccine solidarity with Africa, otherwise China and Russia will jump in. He's ganging up with the Benelux on security and migration. And in other capitals, they know all this too. So I don't think they're too worried about what's happening with these elections, frankly. So let me leave it there.
Great, thank you so much, Caroline. And I already have several questions for you, but I'm going to hold on to them and pass the floor to Matt. Matt, go ahead.
Thanks. I approach Dutch politics from somewhat of the opposite perspective of Caroline as an American who has been living in the Netherlands for the last 10 years, or on and off actually. And I wanted to talk about two things. First of all, sort of how Dutch elections look from the outside, and then I thought I'd move on at the end to talking about what the implications of these elections are likely to be for the outside. When you come from the outside of the Netherlands, the thing that is striking, the elephant that you can't get around, is the incredible number of parties. It's a system where it's incredibly easy to start a new party. And the implication of that is that a lot of international political trends happen to arrive in the Netherlands earlier than in other places because it's so easy for new political forces to make themselves felt on the scene. So the classic example is that right-wing populism arrived in the Netherlands 20 years earlier than it hit anyplace else. The trend that we've been waiting for to see in a lot of places for the last 10 years, that to some extent has been appearing, is the trend of fragmentation and leveling, which stems from the same situation, which is that it's so easy to form parties. There are lots and lots of parties on the Dutch landscape. They sort of spread out evenly across the field of voters. And you've seen some of that occurring in other countries as well, in Spain splitting from a two-party system to a four-party system and so forth. So for international folks, it's interesting to look at that. That's what we've been expecting to see. So I'm going to start up this presentation that I made to sort of show how this goes at this stage. If I can get this working properly, hold on a sec. Okay, I need to find my share button. Right. Okay, can you guys see this? You're seeing my screen now?
Yes, perfect, thanks.
Excellent. So what we expected to see in the long run in Dutch politics was that all the parties would sort of level out, and you would get the Liberals, the VVD, the Labour Party, PvdA, the Christian Democrats, and so forth, would all more or less have an even share of the vote. The interesting thing this time around is that instead of that, we've sort of got the Liberals, VVD, Rutte's party, are absolutely towering over everyone else. Everybody else is sort of splitting up the rest of the share in anywhere from maybe 8% to 10%, or actually less, 6% to 8% of the vote for each of the other parties. And the The question is why that's happening. So one of the obvious explanations would be that this is the last projection from Tom Lauwersen, who does a great poll of polls summary of what's happening currently in the Dutch political landscape. So the most obvious explanation is that it's COVID. Every major leader in the world is getting a bump from handling COVID, as long as they're not completely blowing the epidemic. And Rutte has not done a particularly good job of handling the COVID epidemic at all by European or global standards, but it's been competent enough. The Dutch seem relatively satisfied with him. Another explanation is that Mark Rutte is a once in a generation political talent. He's just an extraordinarily talented leader with the kind of Teflon coating that people talk about Reagan having had in his era and so forth. So it could be that he's simply much better than the other leaders of Dutch parties. That's a valid, that would be a valid contention. But looking at the coverage of why people in the Netherlands say that they're happy with Rutte, despite this being a rather difficult time economically and so forth. One thing that jumped out at me, which I hadn't thought of before, was an interview in the NRC, the paper that Carolyn writes for, from last week. They visited a lot of towns and found a couple. The voicing at the end, at the bottom of this quote is quite striking. They said, "Please, let's not have any other prime minister. I'll just have to get used to a new one." And for the first time, it made me think about the sense of it made me think back to this to the old paradox of choice thesis that the American psychiatrist Barry Schwartz had. Now it's 15 years old or so, but people usually talk about the Dutch system as giving people an exceptional level of identification because there's so many parties, you can always find one that's close to you. But there's some question as to whether, as in an American supermarket where you have 175 different kinds of salad dressing, whether you really feel a greater sense of control when you're faced with the problem of having to. This is what the ballot looks like this year for the Dutch elections, and I don't know if you look at that and think, somewhere on there is my candidate, or if you just feel a kind of helpless sense of how do I parse through all of these options. There may be some of the latter that eventually takes effect, and especially in a time of crisis, I think some people just feel, look, Mark Rutte is doing an okay job. Let's stick with him. Getting back to so that's one way of thinking about this. Another way of thinking about this is if you're thinking about the Dutch Netherlandization phenomenon, as they call it, that sort of flattening out of all the parties as a possible example of things that are happening elsewhere in Europe. Is it really so unusual to have this situation where you have lots of small parties and then one big one? And actually, it's not that unusual. If you look around Europe at this point, this is what it looks like in Germany. It's the obvious example, of course. I mean, Merkel's CDU is towering over everybody else, who's kind of splitting up the rest of the vote. If we go to, let's see who I had next. Oh, yes, Austria, of course, also. The SPO is coming back to some extent, but still, Kurz is really dominating the scene there. There seem to be a lot of countries where there is a dominant party on the right who has locked up the sort of as consensus leadership. Interestingly, in Poland, it's a party that started out as being the farthest right party, is now no longer seen as the farthest right party, the Law and Justice Party. And one thing that each of these parties have done is they have cannibalized the left's policies. In Poland, they've cannibalized family support policies. And in Germany, Merkel is famous for stealing Labor Party policies or Social Democrat policies. And in the Netherlands at this stage, that's the way Rutte is running his campaign as well. He's making pronouncements like he recognizes that people want a strong state, not necessarily a large state, but a strong state, which is an interesting thing for somebody who comes from the background of the Liberal Party to be saying. So if we sort of summed up how things are, if we think of the Netherlands as possibly being a standard example of things that are happening elsewhere in Europe at this stage, what we're looking at is co-opting the policies of the left. The term that the people who invented for Merkel is asymmetric demobilization, where you steal other parties' policies and just demotivate their voters who don't see any difference. They don't see any reason to go to the polls. The place where this is not happening, where it is actually happening, but in the opposite direction, is Denmark, where the Social Democrats have co-opted the immigration policies of the right, and they are now the absolutely dominant party, with everybody else, splitting up the rest of the vote. So, in sum, you could say the Dutch trend actually has been a harbinger of what's going on in the rest of Europe, and this giant dominant center party and the rest of the party splitting up the vote is what we're looking at. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. There we go. And just to get through, not to draw on for too long here. That's what things look like from a European perspective. I'm American. I don't have any cute slides to explain what the Dutch system looks like from an American perspective, but what Americans also look to the Dutch example as a country which picked up right-wing populism far earlier than it happened in the US. Geert Wilders came along in 2006, Trump got elected in 2016. And in 2019, there was an interesting harbinger as well. The rise of Thierry Baudet on the right was a very sort of QAnon type conspiracy-oriented version of the right, and it was a development in the populist right that got mirrored to some extent in the U.S. And I think Carolyn is quite right that it's been really interesting to watch Volt rise this time around. What often happens as you near Dutch elections, votes are very labile. People don't know who they're going to vote for. The party that gets a lot of coverage on television talk shows tends to rise very fast. In 2019, that was Thierry Baudet. He exploded. This year, Volt is getting a lot of attention, and they're doing very well. So that's a really interesting shift in the direction of politics. So I think I'll leave off there, and then we can move on to Pine.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. And thank you also for a transatlantic perspective as well. So not just a wider Europe, but also thinking from a US perspective. Pepijn, I'll pass the floor to you now.
Thanks. Yeah, I thought I'd give a slight sort of opposite perspective as the Dutchman abroad, although that goes for Caroline as well, of course. Yeah, I thought I'd talk a bit about sort of what I'm being asked about the Dutch elections. And a lot of that is what Matt was talking about as well, which is why the hell do you have so many parties? Who's that weird Trump guy with the strange hair? That was more in 2017. And this year, sort of the focus seems to be all on Rutte and on the Dutch position in the EU. So there's a lot of interest in that. And I think that sort of harps back to last summer. And actually the past couple of years when the Dutch became more active, started forming started working on forming more coalitions within the EU. Think of the Hanseatic League, where they tried to get the group of countries together. At that point, mainly sort of for negative issues, so mainly to block further progress. And I think that is also why there's so much interest in that. And as I said, a lot of it is about Rutte. He's seen as a bit of an elder statesman within the council. He's now the third longest serving behind Orban and Merkel. So there's a real expectation that he'll continue to play this large role because everybody, and I think that goes for everybody on this webinar as well, expects him to still be prime minister after the election and after the months of negotiations. But I think one of the interesting things to think about at the moment is sort of what the election will mean. I think Caroline is very right to say that there's not necessarily sort of among the parties and in their programs much more talk about the EU, but there's a lot more pressure sort of outside of that to speak more about the EU and to think about sort of particularly the difficult choices that EU integration entails. And I think that's something that's still really missing in a lot of the party programs. If you go through them and you see that they do talk about the EU, and they all have plans and they have different plans, and particularly look at the EU in the context of sort of global challenges. So a lot of the parties talk about, well, we need to work through the EU if we want to tackle climate change. They mention it in the context of sort of geopolitical challenges like China and Russia. But when it comes to the really difficult choices in the area of European integration, then it's still not there, particularly in the areas that are most sort of contested within and by the Netherlands. So then I'm thinking about issues like fiscal integration. There are some who will say, well, that we're not going to go in that direction. And I think the VVD still says, well, no Eurobonds and no fiscal integration, to which I think most observers would say, guys, you're a bit too late. That happened last summer. And the only party really, and because I would even say that D66 doesn't really engage with these issues. The only party that does do that is again Volt, which is really interesting. Their section on the EU reads like a think tank report produced in Brussels, talking about the debt restructuring for the South, talking about sort of a qualified majority voting in the council, a Eurozone finance minister, all these sort of big ideas that people in the Netherlands would sort of, it's in their wildest nightmare, would only consider thinking about. But they do engage with those difficult questions, and none of the others do. So I think it's really interesting whether to see whether that sort of kind of push will lead to, if they do get into Parliament, and they do, especially if they get in with 3 seats and they start shifting the debate further, the EU Olifant hashtag doesn't die down after the election. But that sort of debate continues to go. Whether sort of the Dutch strategy as a whole towards European integration will change, and whether we'll actually get a debate around the difficult choices in the EU, because I think that is the thing that's still going wrong in the Netherlands. That debate is not being had, and what you then end up with is a very sort of piecemeal strategy as well. The Netherlands doesn't really know what it wants from European integration, except for sort of the areas that work for it. And that's also what you see sort of in the way that the Netherlands, as Caroline also rightly pointed out, is now engaging more with different countries, but it's still not engaging sort of on the difficult questions. And that's sort of the very typical example, I think, of that was again last summer, where the Dutch were incredibly difficult in the Eurogroup. Of course, Wopke Hoekstra in particular cost a lot of goodwill with Italy and with other countries, with Portugal. And then were suddenly blindsided and thought they were doing effectively also the bidding of the Germans, because don't we know that the Germans also really don't want this? And then suddenly we're blindsided by a Franco-German proposal for a recovery fund, which included grants, so the Netherlands went in, well, that's never going to happen. We're never going to sign up to that. And then Rutte, because, and I think Matt also said that, like, I think he is quite a political talent. Rutte managed to sell back home, conceding, going from 0 euros in grants to 390 billion euros. And he came back home and was the victor because of the way that he played it. But the Netherlands lost there because it didn't have a strategy and because it sort of hadn't looked further than just saying no to the next proposal. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see whether this sort of moment where it does feel like something is happening, and I don't know whether that's just because we're all on Twitter and that's where we see the hashtag going around and all the people we talk to think about this anyway, and we're in our own little bubble, or something is really changing. I hope the latter, but yeah, I think we're going to see that over the coming years, and I really hope we do. And that, yeah, I won't have to spend the next couple of years also answering questions about, so what did the Dutch actually want in Europe instead of not sending any money to the South? Because, yeah, I'm slightly fed up with that as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I think that was a great way to wrap up this first round. And for some of our viewers who may have seen our discussion actually of the Dutch position that we organized with ACES and the Dutch Institute in Rome, a debate in September on the clash of stereotypes following the discussions of the Recovery Fund this summer, they'll be well familiar with it. So I'll ask actually all of you a question, which goes back to one of the points that Caroline made. Why is it that the EU elephant has emerged in these elections? I mean, is it also a COVID effect? I mean, because the sort of emergence, and I think this is a double question, why now? And 2, is it really just, as you're saying, maybe in our Twitter bubble? I mean, or is it really a real effect beyond just Volt, beyond a limited section of the electorate and a part of the media?
Can I kick off?
Yes, absolutely.
I think it's genuine. I'm not sure how large it is. That remains to be seen. But for years and years, we had populist politicians and parties in the Netherlands calling for an exit, or for Greece to be kicked out of the Eurozone, for a Dutch exit from the Eurozone, whatever, all kinds of tastes and varieties. Ukraine association agreement to be scrapped, I mean, you name it. And what always surprised me, as much as I dislike this kind of politics, because I don't think it's feasible for the Netherlands, and I don't want it anyway. But I've always thought these people have the right to say this, you know, as long as they don't violate any laws, they can say these things. What always surprised me is that they never got an answer from anybody. And then you would look to the polls, the Eurobarometer, but there are many other polls. The European Parliament regularly does them too. And then you would always see 70% of the Dutch are actually happy with membership, you know. So where are all these people? This has been the big question, all those years. And I am very proud to say, in a way, I was the first one to write an article about Volt when it didn't have a Dutch chapter yet. Somebody in Switzerland, of all places, where they have a similar kind of movement, students getting fed up with the far right SVP being the biggest, having been the biggest since the mid-90s. The Swiss are the trendsetters, not the Dutch. And winning all the elections and referendums and initiatives and whatever you call them, nobody answering them. And all of a sudden, these students stood up and said, if nobody answers them, we are going to do it. And they started winning, beating the SVP at the referendums. One of those people actually phoned me and said, do you know what this Volt is? Do you know these people? And I just looked them up, found them on Facebook, started chatting with them. And this is how, it took me a month to get it into the newspaper, because people were saying, like, are you sure, let's wait and see if something comes out of it. Maybe we spend a whole page on these people and nothing will ever come of it. So in the end, we spent 2 pages, and the outpouring of mails I got after that, lots and lots of people, like, finally something is happening, and who is setting up the Dutch chapter, and so on. There was a 91-year-old man I didn't know, who sent me an email saying, I haven't voted in many years, but for this one, this one I want to fight for one more time. Can you give me a phone number of these people? There was so much, it was time, I think. It was time. I'm not saying it will change the policy, the Europe policy, even if there, on certain fields there is one, maybe not in general. It will not change this in a big way, as far as I can tell. But what is important is that there's sort of a bottom in the debate, and that there is finally somebody who's saying, so, if we think things should be changed in Europe, why don't we roll up our sleeves and start doing it? It's the next generation, in a way, saying, pull over, it's our turn now. So I think, yes, it is significant.
And, and I'm really curious to hear you say this, because I think this is something that I've been wondering as well. Why is it now, and who is it? And I think certainly, the Volt generation, but not only the Volt generation that's pushing this. But I'd be curious to hear your comments, Matt and Pepijn, on this point as well.
Yeah, I think that this may give a slightly inadvertently exaggerated picture of how prominent an issue Europe is in Dutch election debates. From what I've seen, the burning issues in the election debates are still housing, healthcare, restructuring of healthcare, whether, I mean, the shift towards the left even is concentrated on shifting the healthcare system to reduce own contributions and things like that. And when Europe does enter in the party programs of some, I mean, inevitably when an issue comes up, it comes up in the way that a party wants to use it. So for the Christian Democrats, European development aid and negotiations with Africa are supposed to be a tool to improve African development and prevent future migration or whatever. People twist things in their own directions. But I also think that part of the reason why some of the pro-European voices are having an easier time being heard at the moment is that for the populist right in this election, opposition to Europe isn't where they think they're going to get the most reaction. So they're not being as vocal on that point this time around as they have been previously. They're concentrating on other issues, which is escaping me at the moment, actually. What is Wilders doing this time around? I guess we'll find out when he debates Rutte.
Well, he's mobilizing against one European initiative, which is the vaccine certificate, but also other forms of European coordination. So there, he's found a way to put Europe into that angle.
Sorry, I lost you. Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I think that on top of that, it just seems like, or it feels like the right moment for this as well, and particularly after Brexit. I think that played a role in general in the way that the country spoke about the EU. It was always, I always felt that one of the reasons why, particularly sort of the mainstream parties didn't feel that they really had to counter the anti-EU rantings on the hard right, and to a certain extent on the left as well, because everybody in the Netherlands kind of knows, even those who advocate an exit or an exit from the euro or whatever, everybody kind of knows that it would be economically incredibly damaging for a very small trade-dependent country that functions as sort of the port of Europe. That is clear to everyone. The Netherlands wouldn't survive in the world without sort of the lever that the EU provide from an economic perspective. And so seeing what happened with Brexit, I think sort of made it easier to talk about the EU. And we've saw it over the last couple of years, not quite yet in the Netherlands, but Rutte has been out and about in Europe with something almost approaching a vision for the EU. It's not quite a vision, partly because, as he stole from Helmut Schmidt, if you have visions, you need to go see an eye doctor. But it's coming close. So I think it's something that was sort of building over time. And then together with what I was talking about, people recognizing that challenges such as climate change you can't deal with on the Dutch level, which is often the argument from those who are against any sort of intervention. Well, we're too small. So then, well, you do it on the European level. And I think that is widely shared as well. I think that all just came together, that it seems like easier to defend the EU, even if not everybody quite does it yet. And as I said, not quite engages with the difficult parts of it yet, but there's some shifts there. And I think that all played into that.
So on that point, actually, and this is kind of linking back to some of the other points that all three of you made. I mean, so it's not just, I guess, who is really talking about Europe, to what extent? I mean, to what extent will this make a difference? Will it matter in the elections? But what sorts of Europe are they talking about? Or what bits of Europe are they talking about? I mean, this goes back to the last points that you were making, Pepijn, in your opening remarks, regarding the potential role that the Netherlands could take in Europe, whether leading on questions of climate change or also on rule of law. And in late December, the ECFR ran one of their, kind of coalition monitors, kind of thinking about the different roles that countries like the Netherlands could take. And that was one of the, in a sense, prescriptions saying, there is a space for the Netherlands to kind of remake its image from the leader of the frugal four, to being something else. And so I guess to turn this back over to the three of you, thinking, is that a possibility? Caroline is shaking her head. Do you want to start?
No, I don't think it's part of a package. I think what has happened since Brexit, and not only in the Netherlands, and don't forget, I mean, every country comes to Brussels to push stuff and to block stuff. In the Netherlands, well, in many fields, like the market, we could phone London. And if London would support us, big country, we just needed a few small ones, usually, you know, the usual suspects, the Danes, the Swedes, you know, sometimes the Belgians, and we were there already. Well, this game we can no longer play in the Netherlands. And for all different EU countries, this balance has changed. And what's happening now is that the Dutch, but others too, they set more priorities. I think they're per theme, they are looking like, what is our winning alliance going to look like? Okay, in financial and monetary matters, it's we gang up with the Nordics, even if they don't even have the euro and are just only there for the market, which we are not. We are there for the whole everything. That's a very loud kind of positioning that we do there. And I must say that this already started, I mean, it's a tradition, but since Wopke Hoekstra was there as a Minister of Finance, I heard from his first Eurogroup meetings already reports that the Germans were trying to tame him a little. Yeah, we know it now. This was long before the budget came up, long before COVID came up and the COVID fund. But at the same time, on other issues, the Dutch are actually getting close to the French. They're getting close to Madrid. I was living in Vienna till not so long ago, and all of a sudden the Dutch were very active there too. So they are shopping around with their list of priorities and saying, like, who is going to support us? And they also have a bucket of issues on the other arm, things that they don't really care about, that they can, you know, give away in exchange. So I think the whole political ballgame in Europe has changed because of Brexit. And I think for the Dutch, this was especially so because they were nicely in the middle of the triangle, Germany, France, and the UK. And all of a sudden they're sitting on the or next to the Franco-German axis. And they have managed, sometimes with screaming loudly and insulting Italians and others, they have managed to maneuver themselves into, you know, a real force. And as Pepin says, on the budget and the Corona Fund last summer, they realized very well that they couldn't win the battle because France and Germany had made up their minds already. But what they did manage to do was bring the numbers down, and to keep their rebates and all that. And this was very loud. And so now the Dutch are seen as these people who don't want anything in Europe, and they're insulting everybody left and right. But when you look a little bit under the bonnet, as it were, you see that they're very active and much more than ever before in making Europe move. And maybe they don't know exactly where they're going, but per subject, I think they pretty much are finding out where they're going. But it's not just one pretty picture, it's several pictures, it's a mosaic.
Thanks for that. And I mean, I'll let Matt, you and Pepin respond. I was just looking at one of the comments coming in through our YouTube channel regarding, you know, this, what I think, you know, you're saying, Caroline, this disjuncture between the emotive outbursts, whether, oh, you know, there's going to be an exit, oh, you know, we want nothing from Europe, but then actually, you know, kind of in different ways, you know, realizing, as all of you have said, that leaving Europe would be insane, even for those who are most, you know, kind of loudly Eurosceptic, and, you know, kind of plugging away in building different coalitions depending on the issue. But Matt, you have your mic off, so I'll let you jump in.
I actually wanted to get both of your reactions to something. There's a traditional alignment of forces in which the Liberals are the party that is the most closely aligned with outside investment interests and with multinationals who have their headquarters in the Netherlands because of tax minimization issues and things like that. And you often hear from those international interests what were our big concern in Dutch economic reforms or reforms around the tax system is that the Dutch not change anything outside of international consensus. Either they do the same thing that the OECD recommends, or they do the same thing that Europe recommends. The difference that I have heard over the last year or so, 6 months to a year maybe, is on issues like the digital service tax, where things are actually starting to move at a European level because the French have already gone ahead and instituted it. When I hear businesses say now, we really want this to be done at the EU level, it doesn't necessarily sound so much like an excuse to delay action anymore. It sounds as if they may have made their peace with the idea that we're moving to a world that has a lot more geostrategic intervention in the economy, and we actually do want this to happen at the EU level. And if that kind of pressure is playing into what business interests are asking of the VVD, that can shift its orientation towards Europe. And I just wonder whether it sounds to you guys like that's something real, or is this just business people saying the same thing that they've always said, like, oh, let's do it at the EU level so we never have to actually change anything.
Pepijn, Caroline, do either of you want to respond? Pepijn, go for it.
Yeah, I guess my intuition would also be that this is sort of, it's happening in several countries and they're going to push it through anyway. So then you might as well sort of create the level playing field by going through as large a sort of venue as possible. And, you know, there's some movement now potentially within sort of the OECD framework as well, because the Americans are shifting under President Biden as well. So I think that is what's driving that. I'm not 100% sure whether there's any sort of shift in thinking in that regard in the Netherlands yet. There's sort of the willingness to countenance sort of a more active state that you also talked about, and you can see that in some of the proposals that they've made together with the French, and actually also in this area. Yeah, whether we see that sort of feeding through into actual policy stance, I'm not quite sure. These kind of questions have been floating around for a long time, even at the start of this government, of course, with the dividend tax and with the changes to royalties, to sort of the taxation status of that. And it's always very difficult to see whether anything actually changes in this. And I haven't looked at the data for a while, but it never feels like the numbers actually change in terms of like the money flowing through the Netherlands. So yeah, that's going to be quite interesting to see whether I guess it's the same sort of dynamic as you saw with the recovery fund. Once it happens on the European level, there's not that much you can do anymore. And once the French and the Germans have signed up, and very soon the Americans have signed up, what are you going to do?
I totally agree with that. But my feeling is that it's not high on the Dutch priority list. They're not talking about it. They're not defending it in particular either. So I think they're just waiting for events to move, for the pressure to rise, change things from the inside, and then move. I think they will move maybe faster than people think they will.
So by changing things from the inside, do you mean trying to create coalitions within the EU to, for example, change the dynamics on, something like the new investment screening mechanism, the push for, kind of more transparency on corporate taxation? I mean some of these big issues that are hanging there.
It could be anything. They can also ask for small change on another dossier. Lots of things are moving in Europe at the moment. And the Dutch have a stake in them all, and I don't think they really want to. After the Corona Fund, Next Generation Fund spat, I'm not sure they're really in the mood to be smashed on the head yet again and stand out and lose brownie points, because that's what they're doing. with this, and I think they're well aware of it.
And I think this is, kind of the thing of kind of positioning to, for future battles. Pepijn.
No, I was just going to say, I think that the investment screening mechanism is interesting because it's something that happened on the EU level, which is, it's a bit of a paper tiger. It's a bit of more of a messaging system between national systems, but the Netherlands didn't have one and will now have to put one in place. So I think that is quite interesting because it's another example of this sort of same kind of mechanism playing through, and the Netherlands sort of shifting towards almost a more interventionist view, basically driven by developments on the geopolitical level, because we all know that this mechanism was aimed at China, and then sort of on the developments on the EU level.
It's almost protectionism for a country that is, free market, let's be open, no restrictions. And so it's a big shift, I would say. And it's not just on investment screening. It's when we talk about the digital giants and what to do with them. They're pretty protectionist as well. And again, they work together with the French, which is very interesting, because the French inclination is always immediately taxing everything, which is not going to work with a couple of Europeans. So that's where the Dutch come in, and they're very proud, like we do this together, and we come from totally different directions and manage to put proposals on the table. And this, I find this interesting.
And I think, this goes in part to what you were asking, maybe Matt, at, kind of at the start of this round, kind of thinking, are these things really shifting? And the question is, where is, kind of the push coming from? I mean, is this just, is it part of a wider kind of push for European, strategic sovereignty, whether, in healthcare, in, investment screening, in controlling supply chains? But it sounds, I see, Caroline, you're shaking your head. I think, there's different dynamics at play here.
I think it's larger. I think it is China, it is Russia, it is Turkey steaming, around Greek islands with half of the navy. We feel vulnerable all of a sudden. And we have, Trump is gone, but it was a good school, let's say, a good kind of education that he gave us over the past 4 years, because he taught us that America has different priorities. And whether America voices these priorities in a very nasty way or in a very friendly way, c'est le ton qui fait la musique, but still the policies remain the same. American priorities are in Asia and not in Europe. They don't see Russia invading Europe as the biggest threat at the moment. So we will have to do it ourselves. And I think this is a very, we live in a mercantilist world. And if the Americans are not going to save us, then we in a pathetic way, then we have to work on our own protection and security. And I think this awareness, many Europeans nowadays are maybe not happy with the European Union and the way things are done, but they're much happier than before in the European Union, And so I think this is also what moves the Dutch government and officials in ministries who are really fanning out all over Europe at the moment.
Which is, and it's interesting. This, kind of the external pushes motivations for more Europe, or a different sort of more Europe, or parts of it. And I wanted to bring in some questions that we have hanging, and one relates to that. It's actually from my colleague Jonathan Zeitlin, who knows that one of the largest problems in Dutch EU policy over the past decade, or even more, has been the dominance of the finance ministry over to the foreign ministry on key economic and financial issues, not only in Europe. And so the question is, this is kind of going exactly to what you all have been saying about a kind of almost geopolitical shift that's taking place, or geopoliticization of what Europe is or what Europe should be. Is this happening?
When you try to filter when one listens to political debates, to what political parties are saying, it doesn't sound as though there has been any kind of fundamental shift in paradigms. If you listen to, I mean, the rhetoric that Wopke Hoekstra uses around questions like, do you like pushing, sorry, pushing burdens onto the next generation is still the same austerity regime rhetoric that he would have been, that a Christian Democratic finance minister would have been using a decade ago. So I really, I have been a correspondent in the Netherlands on and off for 10 years, and I've never managed to get a really straight answer out of the finance ministry about what their sort of ideological convictions are. It's a giant bastion of power that feels very close to me, unlike most of the rest of the Dutch government. But I don't really, it feels as though they've been cowed possibly by the diplomatic consequences of that conflict, but I don't know whether there's been a fundamental rethink of their ideas about.
If I may, this is what finance ministers are for, to keep money left over at the end of the year. You know, that's all they want. They don't want to, they want to spend as little as possible and manage to get as much as possible. So this is not a way to look at Europe. You know, so I don't think that the real visions, if visions are to be found in the Netherlands, which, you know, concerning Europe, you won't find them in the finance ministry. And I think this is the price that we pay for the primacy of the finance ministry over Europe policies. The foreign minister at the moment on European issues is not very strong. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there you go. But you know, on a lower level, a lot of things are happening. I know that the prime minister was not very happy with this Hanseatic, really hardline stance, because it puts the Netherlands in a little niche group of Nordic countries who are in it for the market, just like the UK was. You know, Sweden, Denmark, they all came on the tail of the UK. If you talk to these people, they can still tell you that at the time it was the British to guide them around in Brussels and introduce them to other people. And you know, till very recently, the Swedes voted with the UK in the European Parliament, even after the Brexit vote. You know, even on issues where it wasn't so good for them, but it was just their habit. They were always following London in a way like the Dutch had done as well. So for the people in the foreign ministry, but also people around the prime minister, what Hoekstra was doing with the Nordics was a risky thing. You know, it risks sidelining the Netherlands. So it's countered, but in an invisible way. Nobody knows that the Netherlands is now working on a document, a position document, whatever, a non-paper, I don't know, with Spain on what strategic autonomy means. I mean, nobody knows this, but it would be nice, no? Because at least you get some kind of a balance. But all these things are also happening. But it happens at a lower level. There's no noise about it. Nobody's talking about it. So all we know is the finance minister running the show.
Why do you think that is the case? I mean, because I think, you know, I mean, we've all been kind of commenting that there is a kind of a shift, I mean, away from merely this, you know, kind of economic positioning, if not position. Is it just something that would not be popular with Dutch voters? Is it just something that's happening, you know, slowly? So the fact that the Netherlands has been taking actually a very strong position on, you know, whether it's questions of strategic autonomy or questions, you know, of rule of law, or, you know, climate related questions, or even questions, you know, regarding international development. Why is it, you know, still so quiet? Who wants to jump in on that? I don't know. I mean, Caroline, if you want to follow, or if either of you.
I think Europe is changing. You know, we have a different Europe each time. Europe is a very reactive organism, if you want, entity. It finds it very difficult to, on most issues, to look ahead and to plan, you know, like 10, 20 years in advance. Maybe on emissions, but you know, that's rare. usually things only happen when there's a crisis, internal or external, forcing us to act. When there's a big Russian move, when there's a big Turkish move, when there's a pandemic, and that's when Europe moves. But there are lots of these developments nowadays, which I think makes Europe into more. People used to. Europe was nice for after the wall came down. In 89, we explored diversity and our freedoms, and many countries could join. And, it was so nice all of a sudden. And now people are asking for protection. They want Europe to do different things. And for the right reasons or the wrong reasons, I don't know, but we're building walls everywhere. And Brexit is helping us even to build more walls and to mark the difference between us and them in a way. Then Europe changes, and the position of the country or of all the countries in it are changing too, which is normal, I think.
Regarding what kind of Europe is desired.
Yes.
Absolutely. Matt?
I mean, do you think that all happened? Like, I have been wondering for a while what differences it might have made in Dutch policy towards Europe over the last 3 years if GroenLinks, if Green Left had joined the cabinet instead of the CU. And whether that would have actually shifted things to have a stronger voice inside the cabinet. In theory, in the Dutch system, you have bargains. You have your governing bargain that's set at the beginning of each term, and no one is supposed to depart from it. And if it's not your ministry, then you don't get much say. But I think that in fact, just having Green Left in that cabinet and increasing the weight of the explicitly pro-EU parties in government might have made a big difference. So it seems like, given that, assuming that not a lot shifts in the vote in this election, it looks like it's going to be another compromise cabinet, another liberal-led cabinet and the only question is which other parties participate. But do we think that there'll actually be a different sound towards Europe coming out of this cabinet if it ends up including both D66 and Labour, or both D66 and Green Left, rather than D66 and the Christian Union?
Pepijn, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that it would have made all that much difference, in part because of what Kylie was talking about in terms of how integration is moving at the moment, which is sort of jumping from crisis to crisis and responding to every single crisis with often more integration, which we saw with the current crisis as well, where we got the next generation EU, and that I think that also throws up all sorts of questions around sort of the democratic deficit of the EU, this kind of form of integration, partly because it doesn't really matter then who's in government. And the previous Dutch government was one with the Labour Party, and that Labour finance minister, you'd be very hard pressed in the south of Europe to find people who like him more than Wopke Hoekstra. He, both tall Dutchmen in blue suits, but also both tall Dutchmen in blue suits who say exactly the same, and who said Hoekstra just a few days ago was still talking about, like, when dismissing the spending plans of some of the left-wing parties, he called it Griekse toestanden. So it was still sort of referring to, that kind of irresponsible Greek behavior, which sounds very similar to the booze and women kind of commentary coming out of Jeroen Dijsselbloem. So I don't really think it makes much difference, which again sort of raises all sorts of questions over the way that this form of integration is going. But it's really interesting that you're not seeing the kind of backlash that you would expect just on the basis of that. I think largely because citizens also see the value in many of these areas of deeper integration. At least the output legitimacy is there. But yeah, the input doesn't really seem to matter at all.
In a way, you could argue, sorry, I'll be brief.
No, go for it.
You could argue that the Netherlands, like even a smaller country like Switzerland, which is not a member, but anyway, they are like Europe, but in a small way. The same goes for Germany. You know, it's federalized almost everything that there is to be federalized. So they're used to playing on politics on different levels: local level, provincial level, national, European, and they shift back and fro. You see some of the populists doing the same thing. You know, everybody starts doing this from the one level to the other, which is, yeah.
And, you know, I think this kind of negotiation, I mean, it's interesting because we have two questions in our chat regarding, you know, European integration and what is understood and meant by European integration. Because one of our attendees is asking you that Ruta's strategy on European integration seems to be kind of integration in disguise. So, you know, you're going forward on certain things, as all three of you have noted, but you don't call it, you know, too much integrative or too European for that matter. So, you know, you're constantly, I mean, of course, he's not the only one, you know, kind of playing this double dimension, you know, the national domestic one and then the European one. So that's one question that would be great to have your comment on. But we also had another question asking, you know, kind of if the constitutional referendum from 2005, if that was brought to voters now in 2021, how could we see it? You know, would it, seen from the optic of 2021 and a moment of crisis, a different crisis, what would Dutch voters make of it, or Dutch politicians for that matter?
You know what? I think they would reject it again.
Yeah.
Because it is about...
That was a very confident reply.
Yeah.
Directly.
Yeah. It is an idealistic question in a way. You know, it is a question about the functioning of the European Union. And everybody thinks that it is functioning like shit. I think most governments would agree. Everybody wants to take Europe into a different direction. Everybody wants clear-cut decisions, beautiful, short, comprehensible compromises, but they don't exist. And especially with 27 countries. You know, I really studied the Habsburg Empire for many years, living in Vienna. It was exactly the same. And it was not a democracy, like, you know, in our meaning of the term, of course. But still, the emperor wanted to keep everybody happy. Everybody had to be a stake in every decision, or almost every decision. But with so many ethnic groups and language groups under one roof, you know, people need to feel that they have a stake, otherwise they run away. And I think the same goes for the EU. So we're always making compromises of compromise, and it always looks ugly. And any question about this is going to make people angry, you know, and they will. Institutional questions are just impossible to get right in Europe.
Well, and so
one thing that I wanted, sorry.
No, go ahead.
One thing I wanted to say about the EU elephant issue is that if you raise that as a if you raise the question of Europe as the question of Europe, I've never seen a case in which that was a good idea, because the question simply becomes more Europe or less Europe, and it doesn't, you don't end up getting anything productive out of it. Talking about Europe in the sense of what do we want to do, let's do it through Europe, or having Europe come up as a kind of as a mechanism, as the place where we do these things, it can be extremely positive. But anytime anybody asks, shall we have a bigger, more unified Europe? I think you're right. You would get the same answer as you got in 2005.
So rather than, kind of thinking, more broadly, what is Europe for? What should Europe be? That immediately you're saying, kind of raises, or certainly in the Netherlands, you're saying would raise, kind of alarm rather than an engagement.
I mean, when you have something else that's a priority that people agree on that needs to be accomplished, and Europe is only a mechanism through which it can be accomplished. So, I mean, that's how the COVID relief fund emerged. There was a Europe-wide emergency that had to be addressed. Europe was the only venue in which that could take place, and then you get some political consensus. and some draagvlak, as they say in Dutch. But if you don't have a burning issue to direct your energies towards, then you're just arguing about this abstract concept. You get yes and no, and it turns out to be very divisive.
Pepijn, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I completely agree. I was just sort of thinking about the first question about integration in disguise, and how that is his strategy, and I think that's very clear, and he's become very good at that. And that's already spoke about that, but last summer, of course, was the ultimate example of that. He put on a hell of a show, keeping the council together for several days and nights, and rolling up his sleeves and unbuttoning his shirt in the morning to go talk to the national media. And suddenly, I happened to be in the Netherlands at the time, and suddenly the EU and the negotiations there were the first item on the news, which that doesn't happen very often, not even when there's a really important EU Council meeting. And then it was Rutte there, sort of, who had come out of battle fighting for the Dutch position. And that was all part of how do we sell this there? How do we sell this sort of step into further integration there? Yeah, he's become very good at that. And I think the contrast with Hoekstra was very interesting there, because Hoekstra started playing national politics in the Eurogroup, which is not public anyway. So it's not really the forum to play to the domestic audience to that extent. And Rutte doesn't really do that. Rutte seems to be much better at playing the national stage when he needs to, and actually understanding that he needs to sort of build consensus within the council building. Yeah, so I think that's just going to continue, and we'll see sort of I think very difficult decisions are going to come up in the coming years about how to actually finance that recovery fund, including likely European taxes, which is going to be a big debate. And if you put that on the ballot in the Netherlands at the moment, and you would hold a referendum, should there be European taxes? Well, you're not going to make much money betting on which side that is going to go. And that we'll just see sort of, I suspect, the same kind of show being put on, but it will also happen because I think the Netherlands also realizes that that is what needs to happen.
I think it's more than a show, because sometimes I really, we used to, all member states are having different traditions, different interests, also because of geography and history and so on. So they fight all the time. They never agree on anything. And they usually once in a while they would go to war. And now, instead of shooting with real munition, they invented Brussels, which was empty anyway, so it could absorb everything. And they're shooting with words. And I've often seen, even on my favorite example is on the breakfast directive, where they had to decide for internal market's sake how much grain and sugar a kilo of muesli could contain, and then these fights would go on for months and months, and sometimes overnight. And then you in the morning you go to the council building, and these people, these are modern soldiers in a way, from ministries with their nice suits on and all that, and their hair neatly combed. But in the morning when they come out, they smell of sweat. They have the shirts out of their trousers, and it's like street cats who have just had a battle. And I think those fights are real, but that's also what the EU is for. In a way, it does its work because it's still needed, right?
I love this characterization. I mean, I know there is kind of institutional ethnographies of Brussels. Maybe we should, kind of move that to kind of embodied, kind of sensory accounts, including the smells of, council meetings.
It's male smells, sweaty,
sure
and it's amazing.
I have no doubt about that. Which is, also very relevant because it's not, you're right. I mean, there is, apart from the performances put on for domestic audiences, but also for European audiences. I mean, you are positioning yourself, but then there is the actual, the actual discussion that's happening, which is, was so far a very kind of bodily embodied discussion in closed rooms. I mean, that has changed in part. But, I'd like us to, kind of in a sense, kind of think back to, is anything really changing, not just in the Netherlands, but in Europe regarding this? I mean, there's been so much talk about how the pandemic has transformed or will transform everything. It doesn't sound like it's transformed things that much in this aspect. And so I guess I wanted to push you on that, because one of the reasons I think that the Dutch elections are being watched quite closely, even by observers outside who otherwise wouldn't watch them, is that they are the first kind of significant elections of the COVID moment, right, in Europe. And so the question is, I think, I mean, I can, tell you reading, the Italian press, the Spanish and the French press, it's like, seeing what will happen to established parties if, the kind of COVID effect that Matt was talking about, so seeking stability, maybe giving trust to centrist or those parties, at least that were already in power and didn't mess things up too badly, if that will carry forward. So, I mean, is this moment of ongoing crisis, because it sure hasn't gone away, will this make a difference both in the way in which politicians position themselves in Brussels, the way in which they think of Europe, and even this kind of testosterone fueled I need to go in there and fight for my national interests attitude?
I mean, it's made a big difference. I think like the glaring fact about the Dutch political landscape is that the left has been destroyed, and had been for a while. But it's been interesting to see that they haven't managed to. They were already low. COVID has left them paralyzed. There's been a consensus on the left that you don't attack the government in a moment of crisis. Sort of frozen relations in place. What you see in the way that the left's politicians perform in debates is that they seem to be, they're striving very hard to create the impression of competence. These are potentially reliable hands that could actually be contenders for power, and that I think that sort of paralyzes. It doesn't necessarily paralyze politics, but it forces it into a narrower conduit. And in terms of the way that's going to affect the way that I think that means that that's the reason why the country isn't able to shift at all. And that the thing that's done most observers for the last few months was you have a crisis, high unemployment, people are unhappy, the country hasn't done particularly well at handling the emergency, and yet the only major party leader who has paid a price for the situation, for any of the scandals in the last 6 months, was the Labour Party leader who had to resign. So what is it about this situation that seems to, that paralyzes the political system in terms of its ability to shift the power between parties? I think what we're talking about here is the stance of the Netherlands is shifting because its situation in Europe is shifting, and because Europe is changing, and because the convictions inside the parties that hold power about the country's position in Europe are changing. But the relation between the parties seems frozen.
It's interesting considering, I mean, that we are in a moment of crisis, and that, that freezing is there. Pepijn, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. There also doesn't seem to be much changed in terms of what's being asked of the parties. So we were talking earlier about Rutte now talking about a strong state, of course, adding not a big one necessarily. So I think that was one of the interesting sort of things that came out of the early sort of phase of the pandemic, that we thought maybe this will lead to some sort of paradigm shift in how electorates sort of think about the role of the state and whether that should be changing. You see a bit of shift there, and sort of there's a big question of is that driven by, at least in the Netherlands, by developments in Europe and in the world, or is that sort of something coming up from the bottom? And the latter doesn't really seem to be happening. So in terms of the pandemic having an effect, it doesn't really seem to be having any significant effect on what electorates are asking of the political system, except for let's just keep the guy that we seem to think is a competent manager in charge because we're afraid of changing things at the moment. And for the rest, it has just completely pacified the campaign exactly because everybody sort of is supportive of what's the main issue and sort of the main kind of policy at the moment, which is all around COVID. So I think that is, I thought there would be more shift in that, and I thought that was really interesting. Early in the summer, we wrote a whole paper about that at Chatham House, and I was hoping to see something happening in the Netherlands, but it's just absolutely nothing.
It's the rally around the flag effect, I think, which you see in other countries as well. I think the elections in the Netherlands, they are, in that sense, they come a bit too early. Maybe, I think the German elections will be much more interesting later this year, because Merkel was the shining star in Germany. She really profited from the crisis mood, and people saw her as a competent manager, not only the Germans, but the rest of Europe as well. And all of a sudden that's shifting. She's on her way out, and I don't think anybody's too sure of what who will take her place and what the quality of his leadership will be, because I think it will be his leadership. And there, I mean, we still have to wait for a couple of more months, so a lot can happen there. I think in the Netherlands, everybody knows that Rutte, he's difficult sometimes. He's less, I think he's less easy than they all thought in the beginning. He looks like a very pragmatic guy you can easily make deals with, but hey, not all the time. They've noticed that now. But he's a safe pair of hands. He is determined not to follow the UK out. And they know all the quiet things that he's doing out of the limelight when Wopke is insulting the Italians. So I don't think they really care much. What you see in all the newspapers in Europe is that everybody's more interested in everybody. And during this crisis, everybody is challenging how policies are made or not made. If it's at the right, in Switzerland, the cantons and the Bund, they're tearing each other apart over, who is to blame and all that. Again, it's like small Europe.
Well, and and maybe this is one effect of the crisis. So it hasn't had kind of the shaking up effect that we may have expected. But certainly, I mean, there's a lot of comparison going on, whether it's kind of comparing your own country's ability to handle the pandemic on everything. I mean, everybody can cite vaccination rates to you right now, and who's doing what and who's vaccinating whom, or who's been able to do one thing, open schools or close other things. So I think there is this awareness or interest in certain things, of course, but I think that translates into kind of a broader interest in the politics of other EU states and political choices that are being made. What effects that will have on voting choices is another story. I don't know if either of you, Matt or Pepijn, want to jump in here.
Well, there's, sorry to jump first, but that question of whether there is broader interest in what's in other countries and whether everyone is comparing vaccination rates. I feel like among the elite, everyone is comparing vaccination rates. When I talk to people outside the elite, I am often struck by how many people think the Netherlands is doing just fine when it's not. It's definitely in the lower half of European responses. And I really liked this piece that Mitja Segers wrote last week about the dangers of being a country that thinks it knows it all, the sort of the hubris and self-confidence that the Netherlands has had, and how the identity-focused politics have only exacerbated that for the last 10 years and made it difficult for it to learn lessons, because it doesn't really, even when the evidence is staring you in the face, it's very difficult for the political system here to accept that it has failed at something and should change. No,
you're probably absolutely right that this is, this awareness is, limited, just as, what we were saying about the presence of the EU elephant that's spotted. I mean, we could make all kinds of metaphors here. I mean, what do you see? Do you see a trunk? Do you see which bits of the elephant are you seeing? Pepijn, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I just had a sort of a nice example of that in that I'd been tweeting a bit about that being sort of in the UK, which is sort of has.
We lost you. Pepijn, you froze, unfortunately. Let's hope he will return to us. Well, in the meantime, I'll take advantage of the freezing. Can everybody hear me at least? Yes? I wasn't sure if it was my own internet going out. For those of you interested in Brussels ethnographies, and not only in kind of the changing nature of politics, we will be organizing an event in late May, early June on a wonderful new book that came out, written by Frédéric Morin on the political commissioner, so on the Moscovici cabinet. So we'll keep you updated on that. So that will come through on the ACES website. But we have lost Pepijn.
Oh, he's back.
Are you back? Take another question.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened. Sorry.
No,
he's back.
You disappeared, so we didn't know. Do you want to jump back in where you left off?
I was just going to say that when sort of in response to not everybody apparently responding that much to the differences in vaccination rates, for instance, that I was told by my mother to please stop tweeting so many mean things about the Netherlands when I was making those comparisons, and that actually it didn't seem to feed through in terms of their assessment of how the country was doing. So I just thought that was a very good example of that. So I've tried to tone it down since then because,
Now I understand.
Well, that's what moms should do, is like, don't make your country look bad. I mean, that's not,
That's what she said, yeah.
No, but I think this is a very relevant point that, kind of goes back to exactly how we started this discussion. Is Europe back on the agenda? If yes, for whom? And what sort of Europe? I mean, what is meant, by this kind of, increasing perhaps presence of a European perspective? We're almost out of time, so I wanted to ask you if you have any last closing comments, question. We have one last question regarding, a different sort of Europe, a more democratically chosen Europe. I think, you were all quite pessimistic on any big questions being asked about Europe. So I'm not going to even ask you on the anything about the conference on the future of Europe, because I think we could go on for another 2 hours and I can guess what you would tell me. But do you want to make any last comments, predictions for next week? That's not a fair question. I shouldn't be asking you that, but I'll ask you anyway.
Shall I kick off? I'm not going to predict anything. We have a lot of snow and ice at the moment here up north, but I don't have a crystal ball. But what I think is the case at the moment, that there's so many, the world is changing. Nobody really knows where it's going. In Europe, things are changing too. So everybody wants to be with their fingers on the buttons at the moment, because when it's time to turn the buttons, everybody wants to, turn those buttons their way as much as possible. And even if during this election campaign, nobody really talks about this, it's still there. And I think, as far as I can see, that the Netherlands is trying to get its fingers on all those buttons as much as the Spaniards and the Italians and the Slovenes and all of them. Yeah, that would be my final point.
I like that visualization, and just, kind of wondering which buttons are getting
Charlie Chaplin.
Exactly. Matt, do you want to follow?
I'm going to make a prediction that the Liberals' win is going to be slightly less than what it looks like in the polls right now. I think the number of Dutch who say they're unsure of how they're going to vote is well, it's about the same as it was last time, but that's quite high. 70% or something say they're not entirely sure they're going to vote for. It feels like this overwhelming victory that Rutte has been predicting has been sliding somewhat. But I think Caroline is absolutely right. The elections are happening too soon. They might even be happening just a week too soon, because the debate has just sort of gotten untracked in the Netherlands, and it's starting to feel like people are getting interested. If we had another week or two of debates, I think this could be a much more interesting election. But so it goes.
Great. Pepijn.
Yeah, I'll just make another prediction as well, and that is that in the final week, they're still not going to talk about the EU. And in the 4 years after that, if they last that long, they're also still not going to talk about the EU. They'll continue doing what Caroline mentioned in terms of working within the EU, but they're not going to talk about it in The Hague.
So basically the poor elephant is just a Twitter hashtag.
Yeah, let's hope it survives on the internet.
Let's hope it does. I think that's a wonderful way to close. Thank you so much. And thank you for predictions, partial predictions, but also getting us to think about these elections, I think, from a number of different directions. So thanks so much. To be continued. Let's see where we are next week. And thanks very much to our audience following us on Zoom, following us on YouTube. Thank you for your questions. We didn't manage to answer all of them, but hopefully many of them. And a round of applause to you, and thanks again.